Hey, Sister Students. Today we're going to be talking about the second part of the Civil Rights Movement, marching toward equality. All right, the first thing I'm going to hit is a strategy called a sit-in. It started where African American students, they were mainly college students, they would go to these lunch counters that were white-only lunch counters, where they weren't technically allowed to be. The owner didn't want them there, and the owner would not refuse, or they would refuse to give them service, but these students would just sit there all day, taking up the seats, taking up their business, causing the owners to lose money. So trying to use the economic aspect of gaining equality. And the sit-ins, they spread throughout different parts of the South. As stores began losing business because their lunch counters were being taken up by African American students sitting there waiting to be served. And so it did cause some stores to reverse their segregation policies because of the peaceful demonstrations and the economic profits that they were losing. And so this was a technique and a strategy used by many African American students in the South. Another strategy used by the Civil Rights Movement was called freedom rides. Now, freedom rides are going to be getting on buses bound for the South, southern states, to protest the segregation of buses. Okay, so segregation of buses was illegal under federal national law, but many states in the South were still creating local laws and state laws that were segregating buses, which they can't do that. They can't go over the head of the federal government. And so what these freedom riders did is they wanted to force the federal government, the national government, to step in and defend its laws against the states and against the local cities. And so what they would do is they would get on buses in the north and they would ride through the south on these segregated buses, or the desegregated buses, and whenever they were stopped or attacked, and this was going to force the national government to get involved. So a lot of times these freedom riders were attacked by mobs of people, and the police didn't protect them in the South, or the police even arrested them under those local and state laws. And so what this did is it forced the national government to step in and enforce its laws that buses should not be segregated at any part of the country. And so that was what the Freedom Riders' goal was. All right, in the 50s, we see the emergence of Martin Luther King Jr. emerging as one of the major leaders of the Civil Rights Movement. He believed in nonviolent resistance, so do not use violence, but resist unjust laws. And during a march, a peaceful protest in Birmingham, Alabama, he was arrested. And in 1963 is when this happened. He was put in a Birmingham jail. And in that jail, he wrote a very famous letter explaining why African Americans could not wait for their rights any longer, that they needed to stand up and step out for their rights now. And he argued that civil disobedience was the way to do this, and this was justified to disobey unjust laws because it is effective and because you are abiding by a higher moral law, as he would say. So you're disobeying an unjust law and obeying a higher moral law. And he spelled this out in his letter from a Birmingham jail. Later that year, 1963, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders organized what's known as the March on Washington. This was in August of 1963. And at the time, Congress was debating a civil rights bill, a civil rights law, and so they wanted to march on Washington and show their support for civil rights and for laws that would protect civil rights. And so this ended up being a huge march and a huge ordeal, and 250,000 people attended the march. It is known as the largest demonstration for human rights in U.S. history. And this is where Martin Luther King delivers his famous speech called the I Have a Dream speech. And after the march ended, Martin Luther King got to meet with President Kennedy to discuss civil rights issues. So this is a key moment in the civil rights movement. All right, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is one of the biggest pieces of civil rights legislation that was ever passed in the United States. And it came about in 1964 when Lyndon Johnson had just become president. So Johnson took over for Kennedy in 1963 when he was assassinated. And so Johnson helped to push for the Civil Rights Act. It was something that President Kennedy wanted and was supporting. And so Lyndon Johnson used Kennedy's death as kind of a, hey, let's galvanize support for this. This is what Kennedy would have wanted. Let's get this passed and let's do the right thing. And so he pushes it through Congress in 1964. It passes. And what the bill states is that you cannot discriminate people based on their race, their color, their religion, ethnic origin, in any places that do business with the federal government. Basically out in public, it's a good way to think of it. And if you do discriminate, you will be cut off from federal funding. This especially applied to schools, so schools that were segregating children. If they still segregated children after this bill was passed, this law, then they would lose their federal funding and their federal money. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and African Americans are gaining more and more rights, the civil rights leaders are turning their energy to try to get African Americans out to vote and encouraging them to vote and registering them to vote and trying to get their voice heard in the government. And so in order to do this, several things were occurring to try to do this. The 24th Amendment is passed by Congress and the states in 1964, and the 24th Amendment eliminates poll taxes. So it reduces the barriers to being able to vote. So it enables more poor people to vote in federal elections. And then the Selma marches in 1965, led by MLK, demanding equal voting rights. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is passed, and this cuts down on literacy tests. These literacy tests were used to prevent African Americans from voting who couldn't read. And so what this does is now you don't have to pass any barrier to vote. You don't have to pay a poll tax. You don't have to pass a literacy test. Being a citizen enables you to vote. And you can exert your right to vote now without having to get over certain barriers. Another thing President Johnson did to try to correct imbalances between African Americans and white Americans in 1965 was to create an executive order called affirmative action. And what this does is if you do business with the government, if you have a federal contract or you do business with the government in some way, you have to take steps to add more minority employees to try to balance the ratio between white and black employees. And also, colleges that receive federal money, they needed to add more minorities that they allowed into their college to try to create less of an imbalance in different ethnicities, different races. And so as time has passed and there's been more balance, many affirmative action programs have been phased out as progress has been made. But it started in 1965. This is not a law of Congress. This is an executive order created by President Lyndon Johnson. And lastly, you should know a guy named Billy Graham. He was a Christian preacher, and he advised several U.S. presidents. He became famous as he was anti-communist, and then ultimately he used his fame and his abilities to speak out against segregation, and he and Martin Luther King Jr. became friends, and he even bailed out MLK from jail at one point and traveled around with him. They traveled around together in 1957 speaking and fighting for civil rights. And Graham is also famous as he advised President Eisenhower in the Little Rock 9 crisis as well. So know this name, Billy Graham.